Man walked into a bar, goes up to the bartender and orders a triple shot of whiskey. And he's looking really upset, and the bartender says, "What's wrong?" And he says, "Oh, I've just come from a horrible day. I'm the butler at the house of a rich husband and wife here in London. My name is Jeeves." "What happened?" "Well, the lady came to me and said, 'Jeeves, you're welcome to stay home and enjoy yourself. We're going to a party.'" "Yes, madam." So they go to the party. The lady gets bored and decides to come home early, leaving her husband behind. She walks into the house and she sees Jeeves in the living room and she says, "Jeeves, come up to the bedroom with me." "Yes, madam." So they go up to the bedroom. "Jeeves," she looks at him, "take off my dress." "Yes, madam." "Jeeves, take off my high heels." "Yes, madam." "Jeeves, take off my French lingerie." "Yes, madam." And then she looks at him and says, "Jeeves, if I ever catch you wearing my clothes again, you're fired." So we're going to do this as a structured question and answer time, tonight's session. And my focus is scaling. And so everything related to large-scale Scrum is on the table at any level, at the level of organizational design, adoption, technique. So broadly, scaling in the context of less is what I can share with you, some suggestions and ideas. We're going to do it in a structured way. Step one, you're going to find a talking partner, probably the person right next to you. And I'm going to start the clock for 3 minutes, and if you got a piece of paper, great. With your talking partner, generate questions for me, if you have any, and if you don't, that's fine. And also, as part of this 3-minute activity, you need to come up with some kind of a prioritization of your questions. If you have 2 or 3, figure out what's number 1. And then what I'm going to ask is that one of the 2 people holds the questions and play the awesome and godlike powered role of question holder. So please generate questions, and I'll start the... Now, please figure out who's the question holder. Next. I want a question holder born in the month of January.
I was just going to test this microphone. Can anyone hear that? Through additional speakers? Great. Who was the question holder?
Looks like it's me.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh? Yeah.
That's better.
We've got 3 questions. We'll start with the first one. What's the bare minimum you can start with when implementing this within an organization?
The bare minimum. There's different dimensions of that, like physical, technical environment, organizational support. Did you have a particular dimension in mind?
So last digital here a few weeks ago.
Yes.
He said with safe you sort of start early and pare it down. With less you start small and act.
Oh, I see.
So how do you start?
Right. In other words, kind of like what's the core elements required in less, right? And there's a very precise answer to that question. I'm not connected to the web right now. Actually, I might be, because I was here like 9 months ago, and maybe my computer remembers the network. Let me just... So the short answer is there's something called the less rules. And if you print them out on A4 paper, they're 3 pages long. And the first 2 pages, most of them are related to adoption rather than the structure. The first 2 pages are for the smaller, less framework, and the 3rd page is for the larger, less huge framework. And the short answer is that's what we recommend as the bare minimum for the adoption of less. Now, obviously, to kind of just go through that list would be kind of boring. But let me see if I can, from memory, give you some example highlights. So first of all, we flipped the entire organizational system before the first sprint. This is for a normal small less adoption of, say, 50 people or less. We recommend that you do a less adoption in a relatively small group, like 50 people. Otherwise, you're going to drown the organization in too much change. And for that 50 people, before Sprint 1 and less, we really flipped the system to true feature teams that are end-to-end in an internal open source model with one product backlog and one product owner. With the goal of, by the end of the first sprint, being able to have a shippable product. And that implies that you're going to need not only bottom-up support, but top-down support, because we're actually making a true organizational structural change. That kind of a good summary? Okay. Most of the, just like, in Scrum doesn't define practices. Really, if you understand Scrum well, it's mostly at the level of structure. It says there is a team, it's cross-functional, composed of multifunctional workers, and that's similarly what large-scale Scrum is largely at the level of structure. Yeah. Next question.
Okay, staying
Yeah.
there. Do you recommend tailoring less to the organisation that you're working with?
No, and the answer is really the same reason for Scrum. After all, large-scale Scrum is Scrum. Although, for sure, less or Scrum as a framework are not perfect, the dominant problems in the organization are not in Scrum, they're in the organization. And primarily what Scrum is doing is acting as a kind of mirror that's challenging the status quo based upon local optimization and various other unskillful organizational design elements. So as Ken Schwaber always recommends, focus on changing your organization before trying to change Scrum first. And this relates to Larman's 4 laws of organizational behavior, which are, number 1, organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for mid-level managers and single specialists. Implicitly. So you're not going to find a plaque on the wall that's somewhere that says we're optimized to maintain the status quo for the middle managers and the single specialists. Number 1. Number 2, as a corollary of number 1, any change initiatives, new terminology will be overloaded and redefined to mean the same as status quo. Got that? Okay. Number 3, as a corollary of number 1, the change initiative will be derided as purist, theoretical, religious, revolutionary, and needing pragmatic customization for local concerns, which is really a way of saying, you folks can play in your Scrum sandbox and hold a daily stand-up until it actually leads to a challenge of the status quo of the middle manager positions of the single specialists, and at that point it's not pragmatic. And the 4th law is that culture follows structure. And the implications of that are vast, so I'm not going to open up that box right now. But the first 3 laws point to, coming back to our original question about tailoring less or Scrum for a particular organization, it's really that 3rd law, needing pragmatic customization for local concerns. What that really means is wanting to maintain the status quo for the middle managers and the single specialists. And when that's the dynamic that's going on, then what we suggest is change the organization before changing Scrum. Next question.
The final question we had was, and I think this is probably a similar question posed to Seg as well. How relevant is the adoption of less versus the non-IT elements of transformation?
Can you give me an example? I don't understand yet.
So anything that's not related to the delivery of a software output or a technology-related output. So, for instance, new business processes, new HR.
Let's take business processes as an example. Just to test my understanding, are you asking about and if folks could just put their phones on silent, are you asking about the application of Scrum for that kind of a problem, or are you asking about, so there's two cases. One, we just want to change business processes, can you apply less? Or are you asking, we've got a less group making a product, some of the implications of that product are change in business processes, and is the scope of the teams to expand to the business process change as well as the technical change? Which of those two?
Probably the second one, I think.
Okay. So the way I often answer this question, and this is really, most of these are now Scrum answers rather than large-scale Scrum answers, and it's really they're Scrum questions rather than large-scale Scrum questions, that's fine, is that a Scrum team isn't a software team. They're not a technical team. They're a solutions team. And the vision of the cross-functional team is meant to be a solutions team to create the solution that is necessary. And of course, the domain of Scrum is primarily hardware, software, product development. So no doubt a good chunk of this solution needs to involve that. But if it expands into business process change, training, I urge and recommend that that is within the remit of the team. And in fact, Jeff Sutherland, one of the co-creators of Scrum, this is absolutely his vision, which is that the Scrum team and the cross-functionality of the team expands across all functions, ultimately to include sales, marketing, and so forth. Well, you got to walk before you run, but that's the direction. January. And Simon will give you to the microphone.
The first question that we have is, does the way that you do Scrum depend on the architecture or general the nature of the product or the nature of the technology that you use in the product?
No. It's that simple. I've been building software and hardware for 40 years and been involved in less adoptions for a very long time, and no. Obviously, you want the answer to be yes, and then you want me to come up with some elaboration. But let's maybe open this box up a little bit, not in the direction that would satisfy your itch, but let's say. Why not? Because what we're trying to do in less is worship the customer, not our code. So we're organized, we're not gazing at our technical navels. We're not looking at our software architecture. We're not asking, oh, is it different if it's a microservice architecture versus a, blah, blah, blah architecture? No, we're organized around the customers, feature teams. A customer, my mother doesn't give a crap if there's a microservice, right? My mother wants Netflix to play. That's the perspective we take in less. We worship the customer. So we have feature teams which are around what the customer wants. And if it's the really large-scale framework called less huge, we have requirement areas, and those requirement areas or customer areas are areas purely from the customer perspective with absolutely no concern for the technical perspective, as it should be. And architecture, technology, and so forth will change over time, but if you align yourself with your customer instead of your code, better things will happen. That's the bigger answer why. And as soon as you organize around your architecture, you've lost the plot. You've just completely lost the plot. And then you fall into the component teams model and all of the consequences of that, which you might have seen me talk about before. I could open up that box, but that's a big box to open. But the bottom line is that if you understand the notion of systems optimization, and if you understand the notion of choosing a goal to optimize your system for, and then you analyze an organizational design with respect to that optimizing goal, any form of a component team structure will almost certainly sub-optimize with respect to any meaningful goal other than keeping programmers busy. Okay. Next question.
How senior Scrum Master has to be? I mean, which are
Yeah. So a good Scrum Master in a large-scale adoption has a social network and political influence and power, ideally. Why? Because Scrum at scale is changing organizational design. And the more that the Scrum Masters have influence at the level of organizational design and a social network of political influence, the more effective they can be at this important level. Now, I could flip to the level of what's a good Scrum Master for one team Scrum, and that's an interesting question, but I think I'll leave that one aside. At scale, that's one. The second at scale is a lot of patience, a sense of humor, and low expectations. A kind of relentlessness. Another is they understand the final law of systems thinking from Peter Senge, Fifth Discipline. So what's the last law of systems thinking in the systems thinking movement? Anybody know? There's 11 laws of systems thinking. What's number 11? There is no blame. And the implication of that, there is no blame, is that the way that people behave at work, this is, by the way, related to Larman's fourth law, culture follows structure, the way that people behave at work is largely, maybe largely is too strong a word, but non-trivially a consequence of the organizational system. Why are you, hey, project manager who made a commitment to achieve some scope by a particular date, and your bonus is attached to that, why aren't you more transparent? Duh. And so on. Hey, business analyst, why aren't you learning a secondary skill and focusing on learning how to program and teaching everybody what you know about business analysis when your job title is business analyst, your career path is to senior business analyst, you're going to get a job review in 3 months about how you are as a good business analyst. How come you're not focusing on other skills? Duh. So the organizational design is first order. I'm going to branch a little bit. I sometimes hear people talk about culture change or mindset change. You can't change culture. You can't change mindset. I can quickly identify a very naive and inexperienced so-called change person when they talk about changing mindset, behavior, or culture. You can't. These are side effects of the organizational system. And if the system says there are single job titles with a career path and da-da-da-da-da, any proclamations about behaving different will be second order. So winding this back to there is no blame. The Scrum Masters having sympathy, empathy, awareness, and patience for the fact that the apparently strange ways that people are behaving in the system have been a side effect of the system itself. Okay? Next question.
Another question.
Oh, hold on. Are you making up a new question?
I was going to write that. I'm not making up. I do want to right.
Please.
So, first of all, a fact. I'm working on a safe structure and scale agile environment where a lot of developers. And a fact is that I want to define architecture as a program team that takes from a portfolio backlog some feature requested by the customer, and this feature has pointed out the different Scrum team that are going to implement this feature. A fact is that
In other words, a traditional waterfall.
yeah.
Okay. With new labels. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
regardless that, the major, the bigger critics that right now we have developers, they are feeling completely detached from the customer first. And second thing is the fact that the developers don't see innovation.
So all of that is some kind of a critique of SAFe, which I know very little about. Is this coming to something about less? But don't ask me any questions about SAFe. I know almost nothing about it.
So, okay, so is how less takes care of innovation?
First of all, let's start with the more basic case of architecture, because I know you brought that one up. So in less large-scale Scrum, because large-scale Scrum is Scrum, and Scrum is based upon cross-functional teams, whenever you have an organization that's based upon cross-functional teams, communities are the standard organizational design element to deal with cross-team concerns. So this is, advice as old as time. So therefore, in less, communities are an important mechanism. So for example, there will be an architecture community, and this community will have members from the different feature teams. As a adoption comment, when you're first flipping the system, I recommend that something like, for example, no more than 1 out of 3 of the old architects as part of the architecture community, for reasons that you can probably foresee. And then if the problem under design cuts across the entire product, then it will be members from the architecture community, which of course are just regular plain old programmers from regular plain old feature teams, who get together to do some speculative design across the different teams. But I want to make it clear that you understand that this is not a separate group. These are just plain old developers and plain old feature teams, and they're part of this community to deal with a cross-cutting concern. Picking up that point. Now, coming back to innovation, one of our suggestions, one of our experiments in less, is to, if you're going to do innovation in a concentrated way, to rotate this responsibility across feature teams. And there's really a generalizing point then, which is that if there's any kind of concentrated, unusual specialization for a while, focus it in a team, regular feature team for a while, and then perhaps rotate it for a while to get more diversity and innovation and to have more of a chance for people to participate. As another variation, imagine that we've got a big complex build system and it needs a lot of work on it. Who does that? No separate build system team. Basic understanding of less is that there are no special teams. There's just plain old feature teams. There's no other groups. So then one of the plain old feature teams would take on that responsibility for a couple of sprints and then rotate it to another. And then the same thing if you have some kind of concentrated innovation, one of the teams would pick it up, perhaps by volunteering. Another comment I'll make, I think you said something about the teams in the group that you're working with not seeing customers or something like that. So one of the less rules is this, that the product owner, there's only one product owner in less, there's not a fake product owner per team, which is just another name for business analyst. There's one and only one real product owner in less, truly the owner of the product, such as the head of product marketing or management or so forth. And so the rule in less is that the real owner of the product, acting as the product owner, focuses on vision and prioritization. But the teams focus on clarification and specification with users, customers, as much as possible. So, meaning to say that the regular plain old feature team talks directly to the real customers, users, to do clarification of items. And this is actually a corollary of, we recommend an approach called stories. So stories is an idea first proposed by Ward Cunningham in a paper called the Episodes paper, and then Ward Cunningham was the mentor to Kent Beck, and then Kent Beck picked up the idea of stories in XP. So if you've heard of stories, that's where they come from. And the big idea of stories created by Ward Cunningham, as he says, is stories means direct talking between the real coders and the real customers. That's the definition of stories by the person who created the idea. Direct talking between the coders and the customers with nobody in between, including not the product owner. So it's central to less that we're connecting the real teams with the real users' customers, and that's built into the rules. It's such an important idea. And that, of course, isn't a new idea. The idea of getting rid of all of these layers of indirection and having the real coders with the real customers is something that I learned back in the 1970s when I started my career as a developer. That's why my official job title back in the 70s when I started, I grew up in Canada, was programmer analyst. Because the normal recommendation, at least in Canada, was that the programmer has to also be the analyst and do the entire stack of all functions directly with the real users. And so we express that in less. Did that answer that question? All right. Are we on January still? Are we into February? February, then another February. March. Oh, is that February? Oh, you missed it January. Okay.
Know that much about less and is considering implementing large scale Scrum. What would you say the principal advantages compared to other large scale Agile frameworks?
It's less. And I mean that literally. It's very simple. So, I'm a recovering RUP consultant. And even wrote a book on it. The foreword was by the creator of the RUP, Philippe Khrushchev, and I've got a long background in this. So I've been working in scaling for a very long time. And in the rational unified process, there's a relatively long list, prescriptive list of processes, roles, artifacts, techniques, best practices, and so forth. And year after year after year, I saw failure with the introduction of RUP. Now, I'll open up that comment a little bit more in a moment. Now, also in RUP, we were taught, and then I taught others, this following idea: tailoring down. Meaning to say, okay, it's a big list, but you should make it as simple as possible. So from the 13 possible roles and the 17 possible artifacts, boil it down as simple as possible and make it as simple as possible. That was always our advice. Nobody ever did that. In place after place after place that I went, when in theory they could have tailored down and made it really simple, every group that I worked in made basically the biggest list that they could. And it's the kind of thing that maybe if I'd thought very carefully I could have anticipated, but I just didn't see it. And it took me years, viscerally, to get this direct experience of doing large-scale method adoption with a big list to really see the subtle dynamics of what goes wrong. And it's a very interesting kind of exercise to explore why do people take the big list even when they're encouraged to tailor it down. There's a lot of reasons. There's easily 7 or 8, but for example, who are you asking to tailor it down? People who are ignorant of the details. So they're hardly the appropriate people to tailor it down. For example, the senior management has come in and said, we're doing RUP, we're going to spend 200,000 quid on educating and coaching and so forth. And then they do that. And then if you were to go to the senior management and said, oh, we'll take one of the things. Well, then people say, oh no, you didn't get your money's worth. You've got to make a bigger list. It's not complicated enough. Third, what I've noticed is that the more complicated and prescriptive these lists are, the more they are like the status quo organization. And so if you want to really fit into the status quo organization, the longer the list you take, it turns out to be the better. And I could go on and on. Oh, another one is often these frameworks are sold with best practices. And so how can you go to your senior management and say, well, we're going to delete 95% of the best practices? No, says the managers, We just paid for getting all of these best practices. You got to do this stuff. And on and on. So what I've come to learn very directly, and then you get cargo cult adoption. You get this kind of just essentially mindless adoption, which leads to all kinds of bad things. So what I've come to is the following. The smallest possible thing that you can say prescriptively. So make it as small as possible, and then have people scale up or build up with a focus on why and avoiding adding stuff. And it's interesting that these so-called scaling agile frameworks have a lot of stuff in them, because I don't know, those of you in the room were around at the beginning of the agile movement, but we used to say all the time, me and the other folks in the beginning movement, barely sufficient methodology. That was the catchphrase, barely sufficient methodology, because we saw very deeply that along the scale of prescriptiveness, you want to go to the lowest possible level that you can go. That was a central theme of the Agile movement for deep reasons, which I can open up, but I might not right now. And so consequently, what we're trying to do in less, like Scrum, is provide the smallest possible framework that will actually kickstart the structural change and empirical process control. And to maybe look at it in terms of a scale, let's say this is a prescriptiveness scale, where at the high end you've got lots of prescriptiveness, and the RUP is a good example, and at the low end you've got things like the learning organization movement out of MIT and so forth, the fifth discipline. Personal mastery, shared vision, systems thinking. So let's come back to the phrases barely sufficient methodology and build it up from a small number of elements. Well, the logical conclusion of barely sufficient methodology is that you should say nothing. You should just come into an organization and say, continuously improve, optimize your system. Thank you. Now, there's a context that, and I didn't know this when I started working as a consultant, it just took me like sort of 15 years to really get clear on, is the implication of this with respect to Shu Ha Ri. Who, and I'm not trying to make you feel bad, I just need to know if I need to define it. Who does not know what Shu Ha Ri means? All right. This is a learning cycle that was introduced by Alistair Cockburn, one of the early thought leaders in the Agile movement, in the early days of the Agile movement. And it's 3 major stages that a learner goes through. And it comes from the Japanese martial art of Aikido, but it's applicable as a journey of learning. The Shu phase is when the person is following the kata, the standard movements in the martial art. And it's necessary when you're beginning to have something that you can follow for lots of reasons that you probably understand. The Ha level is when you've mastered the kata, and now you're asking, what are the variations? What are the exceptions, and why? You're starting to break away. That's called the Ha level. And the Ri level is when you've deeply mastered the underlying principles, and for example, you could create katas because you understand these first principles very deeply. Now, winding back to prescriptiveness and this. Here's my conclusion after almost 40 years of consulting. For an organization that is at the Ha or the Ri level, and there are such, don't give them any prescription. That's an insult to their level of maturity and insight and intelligence. So for a Ha or a Ri level organization, that's where you should be, focusing on coaching at the level of why, systems thinking, really the level of the fifth discipline. Personal mastery, shared vision, team learning, systems thinking, because they can work at that deep level. For a Shu level organization, and what I'm saying is what the original Agile movement was largely trying to say, for a Shu level organization, you want to be as far down here as possible, because a lot of harm can be done by introducing prescriptiveness. cargo culting, and so forth. And so you want to be as far down here as possible for a shoe-level organization that's scaling. And that's what we're trying to do with less. What's the minimal amount to kickstart the structural change and the empirical process control that we're trying to create in large-scale Scrum? Yes?
Put your microphone on because it's just about to fall off.
Thank you. Actually, he just wants to play with my bum. We're into March, I believe. March, yes, please. And our colleague needs a microphone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Didn't actually have time to prioritise these, so I'm going to pick one at random. So as you move from the cozy world, people love your methodologies, into a big organisation, what do you typically find are the barriers to implementing less?
I don't know. And the reason is because of the nature of my work and what I'll call selection bias. Because I've been focusing in the Agile space and the scaling space for a long time, I get an email once a week that says, Craig, our company wants to adopt less, come and help us. So I'm never at the building interest phase in a traditional organization that doesn't want to do it, which is essentially your question. I come into an organization where the senior leadership has said, we want to change the organization to this. They might have read our first less book, for example. We understand some of the implications. Help us go from that point to the next step. So I understand the question is a very important question, but I don't have personal experience in how to address it. Although I've worked with other people who have a variety of tips for building interest in a less adoption, and those include giving people the first less book, sending them to less.works. I've even seen a company do a serious less adoption after watching one of the videos at less.works where I deconstructed the component team organization. It led to the senior managers, the CEO, saying, God damn, he's describing exactly what our problem is. The light bulb went on and that was all they needed. So building interest techniques. Bringing in an expert, you're never a prophet in your own land, to give a talk, arranging an internal course on less to build interest, sending people to a public course, finding allies or champions within the senior management side, the one or two allies that might be interested. Think like a politician, not like an engineer when you're doing an adoption. So those are a few suggestions.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
So the next question would be, from the perspective of somebody within an existing Scrum team who has been asked or told, dare I say it, that you are going to move to less, what would your advice be?
They shouldn't start the less adoption. As we recommend, a less adoption is based upon, first of all, top-down support and full knowledge and education by the leaders. I want to make this clear. It's not like in a less adoption that you just have buy-in by the senior leadership. It's not like they phone in the support. In a less adoption, the senior management for this 50-person group, they become world-class experts on the subject of less and organizational design. It's not supporting, it's knowing. The senior managers do, and then they're deeply involved in this, as well as bottom-up, point one. Point two, we recommend that a less adoption as far as possible be done by volunteering, by which we mean that these 50 people, we encourage those, once they've understood the implications of this change, that aren't interested, that we find other places for them in the organization. We have a less guide called job safety and salary safety, but not role safety. So another thing we always introduce right away at the beginning with a less adoption is this principle and policy of job safety and salary safety, because I'm trying to remove fear from the organization. If there's any fear about change, you're on the road to ruin. So by having job safety and salary safety, by a volunteering model where people who don't want to participate can go to old traditional parts of the organization, and by having the people remain or who come in who want to be there, it ameliorates a number of these concerns. That's how I recommend approaching it. Okay. March. April. Please.
I'm not very knowledgeable in this framework. I apologize if this is not applicable.
No, it's cool.
When I try to help companies adopt kind of agile and scaling agile, one thing I've seen the biggest drawback is normally the shops of the way they motivate their staff sometimes is counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve. For example, there was one company I worked for where they had I've forgotten the terminology they used, where there was a specialist QA kind of community of practice. It's like community of practice where QA. So they basically got rid of the silos where there was a QA team, developer team, business analyst team. And
How did they get rid of silos then? Or was that the prior case?
They did that, they got rid of the team.
Okay, yeah.
Then they started community of practices, and it looks what happened that all the people that were managers in the QA became managers of these community of practices.
Yeah, so I have a guideline for setting up communities in less. The people who are members of community can only be hands-on full-time developers. You can't be a member of a community unless you're a full-time developer in a feature team. That solves that problem quite quickly. Okay. Another question then.
The biggest problem I've seen when trying to implement Scrum and Large Scrum is same topic about motivation, especially where it's very bonus-centric. People generally don't think about what's the best for the team. They're very focused on their own benefit.
Okay, I get the key point. So there's a kind of a journey to the answer. If you look at the research of motivation theory, occupational psychology, performance-based bonuses have no value at all. That's not my opinion. I can show you the research on this. It's unequivocal that performance-based, if you didn't know this, performance-based bonuses have no value at all. Even better, performance-based bonuses are associated with reduced performance. And the research on this has been demonstrated again and again and again in behavioral economics. The creators of this field, like Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. Performance-based bonuses degrade performance and make things worse. And therefore, if you're going to take an evidence-based management approach to management, they should just be completely eliminated from organizational design. And fortunately, lots of companies don't even have them. It tends to be an unskillful practice you see more in the financial services industry. Do you work in financial services?
No.
Okay, but it's most common in financial services. And you go to lots of other parts of the world in countries, companies, domains, telecommunications, printer development or whatever. There's no bonuses, there never has been, so it's just not an issue in a lot of companies I work in. In companies where it exists, the end state goal is to eliminate it completely if you want evidence-based management. If you can get rid of them right away when you start off with this 50-person group, then great. But if you can't, then I recommend a principle of minimize the harm and minimize the overhead necessary for them, recognizing that they just generate waste. For example, get all of the managers out of the picture completely, so they've got nothing to do with this, and have any apportioning of bonuses be based upon a 360 review process, which both democratizes the evaluation and gets the dysfunction of overhead managers out of the system with respect to this problem. Another example of reducing the harm of bonuses when you can't get rid of them is to raise them from the individual level to the team level. And this softens the blow. Neither of these things solve the problem. If you study the research, very fundamentally, they should just be eliminated completely. But if you can't get rid of them, figure out how to soften their blow.
Last question. Okay. When you're scaling Large Scale Scrum, you've got multiple Scrum teams. You said the primary way knowledge sharing or general direction is through community practices?
Yes. Yes.
But there is no overgun. Okay, is that the only way of sharing? Like, do you have scrums? How do you manage that communication?
A Scrum of Scrums is not a knowledge-sharing technique. It's a coordination meeting for tasks with respect to the current sprint, fact. So you would never use Scrum of Scrums. Now, a community of practice is an organizational design element, but it can be coupled with techniques, meeting techniques. For example, World Cafe, lean beer, which is far better than lean coffee. Open space. Are you familiar with any of these? No. So open space, World Cafe, lean coffee are meeting techniques. Those meeting techniques, for example, would be proposed and organized by a community. Suppose that the UI community or the test community wants to increase learning. They might organize a open space meeting where the theme is related to testing, for example. But the key point there is that the community would initiate or organize the activities that the group uses. Okay. March. Or is that April? April. April. May. May.
How does less work with distributed teams and cost time zones?
So how does less work with distributed teams? Is that the question?
Yeah.
All right. For this one, first of all, I'll just make a couple of points. Here it is. This is the first less book, that's the second less book, and that's the third less book, which is coming out soon. In the second less book, which is the practices book, first of all, there's a whole chapter on multi-site. Your vision might be occluded because of the flip charts, but trust me, it says multi-site there, chapter 12. And so the first generalizing answer is read that chapter, which has a lot of experiments to make multi-site work in less. And I could easily talk for an hour and a half just about multi-site experiments. So I think what I'd like to do now is dive into one that there might actually be in mind. Like whoever asked the question might have a specific scenario.
I think in my case, I work with their teams in the US and Japan and London. So trying to coordinate across those teams is quite difficult time zones.
Okay, so essentially the question is coordination. Let's start there. So from the point of view of, let me see if I can show you a bigger picture. Here. No, that's not really a bigger picture. I think I have, actually it might be back this other way. Yeah, that's the picture I'm looking for. Let's look at coordination from the perspective of events in Scrum. So this is in Large Scale Scrum. The first point of coordinating between teams that are in different cities is going to be in Sprint Planning 1. Because in less, as the graphic suggests, there's only one Sprint Planning 1 and it involves all the teams together, or at least representatives of the teams. Fact. Now, this is a meeting at a moment in time, and leaving aside general relativity, which is frames of reference and the notion of simultaneity I don't want to get into, let's pretend that there's such a thing as now that will be common between the three cities. So the most basic question, let me, before I go further, when you do less well, it's rare that part 1 is more than 45 minutes or an hour. Extremely rare. I've never had to coach a group where it took more than 45 minutes to do part 1, even when there was 8 teams. So when you do this well, the first meeting that involves representatives from all the teams isn't going to be very long. I would say my median time is 45 minutes, which means that you only need a 45-minute common window across all of these different time zones. And yes, we can come up with scenarios where there is no 45-minute work window across the different sites, and that really sucks, because that means then someone's got to stay up late or get up early. But leaving aside that edge case, there's usually at least a 1-hour overlapping window across the different sites. And that, therefore, usually solves the part 1 coordination problem. Part 2 is done, as the graphic shows, separately by each team by themselves. And so there is no coordination needed for part 2, even if you've got teams in different cities. I should also mention, if it's not clear, that LACE is based upon feature teams, which are work across the entire stack, and there's an internal open source model. There's no component teams with private code. And when you move to an internal open source model with a feature team that can work across the entire stack, your so-called dependency problems just evaporate, because dependencies are a self-inflicted wound which are a side effect of having component teams and private code. But when you get rid of component teams and you get rid of private code and you've just got open source and any team can work on anything that they need to create their features, virtually all dependency problems go away. So sometimes people ask about coordinating between teams, but they're actually not in an open source feature team model, and then they're going to have a world of coordination problems. But if you move to feature teams and open source, those just melt away, and that solves a lot of problems. The next coordination activity of relevance is product backlog refinement. In the simplest case, product backlog refinement in LESS is just done by each team separately, so a very simple answer. But there's an optional meeting in LESS called overall product backlog refinement, or overall PBR, where a couple of representatives from each team get together with the product owner, and the main goal of that meeting is, for example, to get some common understanding across the larger set of items, and to do, for example, if they're using relative point estimates and planning poker, to do some estimation altogether. And then this, by the way, solves the synchronization problem in estimation. If you're using story points and planning poker, a problem with multiple teams is that because there's no absolute meaning of a 1, a 2, and so forth, you have potentially a synchronization problem. But if they do this in overall PBR altogether, problem solved. Trivially. Another thing that happens in overall PBR if they do this is that the members of the different teams who are there then select what items they're going to take a deeper dive into when they do single team PBR later on. So a typical pattern in LESS is that representatives from all the teams come together for a couple of hours or half a day. They do overall PBR. They talk together, they synchronize, they do some estimation, and they decide which teams are going to take a deeper dive into different items. And then that meeting ends, and then separate teams do separate product backlog refinement independently. And again, in that case, the fact that there's different sites is not an issue because there's no longer any coordination. The main coordination issue was the overall PBR meeting, and that would be done, if it's multi-site, I normally recommend with Google Hangouts and using Google Tools as a way to share the digital information. The other coordination issue is communities, like an architecture community or a test community or whatever. That'll have to be solved with Google Hangouts and other digital tools. The next meeting for coordination is the sprint review, and if it is multi-site, then, and there is only one sprint review meeting as the picture shows here, so that means that it will have to be held, and I know this will sound radical, using the internet. And people will be able to, if the product owner or the inspectors are at different sites, they'll be looking at different iPhones or different iPads or different browsers or punching buttons on different printers, whatever the nature of the product is. And a lot of the discussion will have to happen using multi-site tools of text chat and Google Hangouts video conferencing and so forth. That's kind of the simple short answer to the question, and the book goes into a lot more experiments. We're on April, is it? Another April. Yeah.
Yeah, these questions are coming from a company that's got a lot of Scrum teams and they're looking to move into larger projects. With that viewpoint, the questions are related to like, how do larger teams integrate panel integration?
In LESS, of course, there's always at least 2 teams on the product, up to 200 teams on the product. So integration between the teams is critical. And we recommend a technique and a practice and a behavior. Where's my big fat pen? Maybe it's over here. Now, we recommend in LESS an approach called continuous integration. Now, I've come to learn over the years that very few people know what continuous integration means, and I'm going to share with you the surprising meaning of continuous integration, which very few people know. Continuous integration means to integrate continuously. And that might sound funny, but I go to so many groups and I ask them, are you doing continuous integration? And you know what they answer? They say, oh yes, we have Jenkins. In other words, they've confused integrating continuously with a build tool. There is no relationship between build tools and having a build system and integrating continuously. Integrating continuously is a behavior by developers. It's got almost nothing to do with tools. So in LESS, we have to establish the behavior of integrating continuously. And by the way, as a coach, I recommend you expunge the phrase continuous integration from your vocabulary because it seems to have gotten distorted into incorrectly meaning build systems. And I recommend you replace it with integrate continuously. So what does it mean to integrate continuously? 1, I'm assuming you're programmers when I make this next comment. So you're cutting code in Java or Ruby or whatever, and you've checked out a file from your version control system, Git, Subversion, whatever. and you keep it checked out for 1 hour before you commit. So how can you possibly say that we're integrating continuously if programmers are keeping their files checked out for hellaciously long periods of time, like an hour each? And integrating continuously, continuous integration, comes from extreme programming. That's a fact. And in the original XP teachings, this has all been covered, but it seems to have been forgotten or lost as Agile has become kind of a cargo cult adoption around the world. So the teachings of continuous integration from the horse's mouth, from the place it was created in XP, was to check out, check in the shortest possible cycle time. That's the foundation of integrating continuously. And that then begs the question, what's the shortest possible cycle time? And XP, which created the idea of continuous integration, then had an answer for that as well, because this is also part of XP, which is 1 TDD cycle. So the idea of continuous integration from the people who first created the idea was that you check out a file, you write 1 test, which typically takes around 1 minute. You write the small amount of code, which is typically 1 to 2 lines of code, to make that test pass. You do the third step of refactoring to clean up the code. And at that point, everything should be passing again. And then you commit back to your version control system. That's typically in the median unit TDD cycle time in Java is 3 minutes. For at least from the measures I've kept over the last 20 years or so. So, in other words, the longest that any programmer would ever be not integrated with everyone else is 3 minutes. That's the heart of integrating continuously. And if you don't do that, you can have Jenkins servers out the wazoo, wherever a wazoo is. I've never figured that out. And yet, if people are keeping their code checked out separately for hellaciously long periods, like an hour or even worse, you're not integrating continuously. The second key idea of integrating continuously is to avoid branches. No team branches, no developer branches, no feature branches, but instead, as Google calls it, head of trunk development, where everyone, to use subversion terms, is just pulling off of and pushing back onto the head of trunk. So there's no branches except in the kind of edge case of we've released and we need like a tag for a release branch. But everyone's just on head of trunk, or to use Git terminology. So let me ask you, when you do a commit in Git, where are you committing to? Does anyone know? No. You're committing local. So Git, if you didn't realize this, is a world of branches. Everyone's local is a branch. This is not at all a criticism of Git, but you just need to see that every Git local is a branch. So therefore, because we want to avoid branches, if you're using Git, that means after every 3 minutes when you commit, you have to push to master, push to master, push to master. Otherwise, you're not integrating continuously. That's the heart of what integrating continuously means. And that's what has to be in place in this group that wants to scale their integration practices. And if they're instead focusing on a more fancy build system with a better Jenkins, they've lost the plot. And a third point then is a CI system that is fast, gives fast feedback, so that when everyone's code is then pushed together every minute, this thing is running 24/7 to give the fastest possible feedback. And we have a whole chapter on this, on scaling CI systems in chapter 10 in our second LESS book, if you want to know more about it. But also these days, when we wrote that chapter, we didn't have AWS available to us and so forth to scale in ways that you can do so elegantly today. If I were to write that chapter today, I would really take a cloud AWS approach to scaling your CI system. Okay?
Yeah, the other question was how do you ensure visibility?
How do you
ensure visibility with feature teams? The feature team can clearly see what's happening and then the team are doing. How do you ensure across multiple feature teams that everyone understands what everyone's doing?
everyone what?
Everyone understands what everyone else is doing.
Well, in less the way it happens is that or at least representatives are all together at Sprint Planning 1. It's common across all the teams. And let me bring up a very relevant point here. In addition to there being a common Sprint Planning 1, in addition, for example, to having an overall product backlog refinement that involves all the teams together, there's one sprint. It's not a sprint per team. It's the sprint for the whole product. And this creates visibility, or let's use the Scrum terminology, transparency. Because then you can see very clearly at the common sprint review across all the teams whether they were having trouble or not. That's the quick answer to the question. Common sprint, common major meetings, and communities. May. Yes.
Hi. So,
Hi.
say a scenario where CEO, CIO have learned about less, they love it, they bring you in, right? Announce it's the organisation, or it's covered as in we're bringing in less, we've got Craig to bring it in. The teams below, they're all happy, they're going to get away from waterfall, we're going to do some real agile now.
So they're all on cocaine, basically.
Well, you've got the momentum.
Apparently, I've never actually taken
You've
cocaine.
got the buy-in from the top and the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Right, and then you've got middle management.
Yes.
Now, you've got middle managers who are saying they're doing it, but they're really doing cargo cold.
Yeah.
You've got middle managers saying,
Are you going like, how do you deal with that?
well, I'm getting it. So rather than one scenario, basically you've got resistance with different approaches to resistance. So the resistance could be, yeah, we're going to do this, or we're doing it when they're not. In the middle
Right.
layer.
It's Larman's second and third law, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you've got ones that say, yeah, we'll get round to it, so they're using inertia to resist against it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then there's various other approaches, because they are essentially political masters within that domain.
Well, no. In a less adoption, what normally happens is that all of the managers lose their position because it's a very flat organization based upon self-organizing. So first of all, there isn't those folks to gum up the works any longer. In this 50-person group, it's completely changed. It moves to real large-scale Scrum. It's not done in a fake way, or we just don't do it. That's one comment. The second comment is if the organization requires line managers, like you're in a bank and the bank says you've got to have line managers, how we recommend doing a less adoption then is that for this 50-person group, there's a pool of candidate line managers. Then all of the feature team members they interview and hire or select from the line manager pool, and they can also fire or deselect the line managers. What's that?
There's a right of recall against line manager.
Yeah, you can deselect the line manager. So that means that the small number of line managers that are left are going to have to earn their keep, because essentially they're serving the feature team members. And they can be deselected if they were to do wacky things.
So that solution, that part of the solution, is that on the website then?
No, I cover it in the course that I'm doing this week. You don't have to do it that way, but that's my recommended way. Okay.
I think you've answered a couple of our questions already, but I think we've got one more question.
Okay. Yeah, dependency management is a side effect of bad organizational design. It's a self-inflicted wound. And when you move to real feature teams and internal open source, it just falls apart as a problem. There's that too, but that's secondarily. I mean, essentially the root cause problem is private code. Yeah. It's 8 o'clock. Much more interesting than me is the pizza. So we're going to end with a bad joke and then we'll head for pizza. Let me see if I can get any worse than the opening joke. A man walks into a bar, orders a triple shot of whiskey, and yells, "The bear scientists are missing." This is in Yellowstone National Park, and it was a Russian and a Czechoslovakian bear scientist who were doing research in Yellowstone, and they hadn't shown up at the reported time when they said they would. They had done their PhDs at the University of Moscow long before, when it was still the Soviet Union, and they'd always had this desire to someday do field research at Yellowstone. Now it's 2015 and all of that's possible. So the rangers round up, they get their rifles, they head out into the countryside of Yellowstone, and eventually they find the camp where the bear scientists would have been, and it's all torn up and there's blood everywhere. And then they hear some bears in the distance, and they creep up on the bears and they see there's 2 bears, and they're like eating body parts and there's blood all over them. So you got to shoot the bears when that happens, 2 grizzly bears. So the rangers shoot the 2 grizzly bears. They come up to the 2 bodies of these giant bears. I don't know if you've ever seen a grizzly bear. They are mammoth things. And they first of all observe that one of the bears is male and one of the bears is female. And then they cut open the stomach of the female bear and pull out the remains of a body with some plastic card identification, and they discover that it's the Russian bear scientist. So the Russian bear scientist was eaten by the female grizzly bear. And then, I'm sorry for this. Then one ranger turns to the other and says, "You know what this means?" "Yes, the check is in the mail." Thank you for your time.